we're recording this meeting. I'm the agency's Land Use and Transportation Planning Coordinator. Pleased to have all of you here today on this Tuesday morning with us. I'm going to go ahead and have a short presentation. We'll include introductions. Well, actually, let's just go to introductions first. Again, Bill Holmstrom, and then we've got a number of DLCD staff here, and we'll just introduce them as they pop up. But otherwise, I'm just going to go ahead and go around the boxes here and point at people and have you introduce yourself just briefly who you're with. Julie, Carl, then James.
Julie Warnicki, I'm the Transportation Planning Manager for the City of Salem.
Carl McNair, Transportation Manager for City of Medford.
Jim McCauley, Legislative Director, League of Oregon Cities.
Thank you. Gabe, Rob, and Steve.
Hi, everybody. I'm Gabe Flock, Land Use Planning Manager for the City of Eugene.
I'm Rob Interfeld, Transportation Planning Manager for the City of Eugene.
Steve Kelly, Long Range Transportation Planner with Washington County.
Great, thank you. Then I think we've got Joseph, Ariel, and Peter.
Hi, this is Joseph Off with the City of Hillsborough. I'm in their Transportation System Unit.
Hello, this is Ariel Nelson with the League of Oregon Cities.
And good morning, everybody. This is Peter Hurley with the City of Portland. I'm a Senior Policy Planner.
Great, thank you. I think everyone else on the call is DLCD staff, except we've got Brian Hurley, who's with ODOT staff, and he's here listening as well. So I'll go ahead.
Bill, you're muted.
Sorry about that. I was just saying I'm getting my screen share started here. Hopefully, there we go. All right, hopefully everyone can see that. We'll just have a just quick presentation. It'll help if I start from the beginning. So yeah, introductions, we did that. We're going to talk real quick about the scope of the meeting today, and then we'll have an open discussion. That'll be most of our time. This is an informal meeting to discuss ideas and concerns. We are being streamed onto YouTube right now, just so folks are aware, as well as recorded, so folks could be able to watch this meeting later if you care to, or anyone out there can do that on YouTube. And we can schedule additional work group meetings if we feel that's necessary in the next couple weeks here. Oops. I'm just having issues here. So the rules that we're talking about today are two rules in particular, Rule 170 and Rule 325. What Rule 170 is kind of the key one. I think that most of our concerns out there are going to be about are it relates to transportation performance standards that are related to when local jurisdictions make plan amendments and zone changes that are reviewed under Rule 60. So that's an existing rule that local jurisdictions use when they're making changes to land use regulations or plan amendments outside of the transportation system planning process. The rule continues to require adoption of performance standards in the transportation system plan. That's required now, and that'll be continued to be required. But the twist is we're requiring at least two standards to be adopted, and that at least one standard must support transportation choices. The other rule we're talking about today, potentially if people are interested, is Rule 325, which has to do with how plan amendments or zone changes are handled in climate-friendly areas. Those no longer will be handled through the 060 process. There's a separate kind of different process for within climate-friendly areas. In general, overall, the objectives of what we're trying to do here is we're trying to make some changes in how local governments do transportation system planning. We want to make sure the transportation system plans meet our climate and equity goals, that we're centering voices of underserved populations in how we make decisions in our transportation systems, that we're meeting targets for climate pollution and VMT reduction, and that we're shifting trips and our focus for our planning into other modes other than just driving. Not to say that people won't still drive, but that we are looking at other modes with more intention. We'll make sure the rules are clear, that they're coordinated with other plans, and that we're not duplicating or doing unnecessary work that's not needed. So any comments and support on that is helpful. So real quickly, what the things I think that the key topics that we've heard so far, and I expect to talk a lot about these today, and other things people have concerns or questions about, the timing of the implementation and when exactly things need to be adopted, and when local jurisdictions will need to start using a set of performance standards or in doing reviews. I think we're open to talking about how that we can do that, which is kind of connected to the next one, which is we've got, the level of service or V over C is figured out. We know how to operationalize that. Other things not we haven't figured out quite, but yeah, that's the message that we're hearing. We need help figuring out what other things are out there and how to make those work. And so are there resources available to support newer updated standards, or is the rule going to put something specific out there? That's what we've heard. How do you deal with conflicts between two standards if you have multiple standards? And then we're open to hearing other issues. So with that, I think I'm just going to go ahead and look for hands up in the air and have a discussion. Yeah, Julie, thank you.
So I guess you raised, some of those key issues. And so I guess what I'm interested in is what is, DLCD's response to those, or, it's my understanding right now, at least last time I remember, the standards, you had to start using the new standards by January 1st of 2023. Is that correct? Which implies that you have to amend your TSP in 2022 to adopt them. And that raises some questions to me about what, do you have to adopt other parts of your TSP amendment at the same time? That's a very aggressive timeline. And it makes me uncomfortable without having seen, I guess what your next point is resources available to support. I've understood you guys are working on some. Makes me nervous to have a rule put in place without actually having seen what some of those are, and maybe you're willing to share those before the rule gets finalized. So anyway, I guess I'd like to hear from what obviously other people have stuff, but I'd like to hear your responses on those issues.
Yeah, so I think the timing question is part of a larger conversation that we're having, and we mentioned that in our cover memo of our most recent advisory committee packet for our advisory committee 10, which is happening this week, that we are looking at some more flexibility and ability for local governments to kind of sequence things. I think this in particular, it probably does make sense for it to be part of a larger, TSP update at some point, and when TSPs get updated is another piece of that timing. So I expect we'll probably just roll it into the next time you do a TSP update, you have to adopt the standards, but we haven't quite figured out. I can't say that, we've decided to do that or anything like that, but that makes sense. In terms of the resources, I think we're still figuring that out. I think there's ideas out there for what some of these measures could be, but I think we're sensitive to the feedback that you're telling us to do multiple standards, and then we don't know what the other standards are, and how are there other ones that exist that we can make work. And so I think we're committed to making sure that works. I just don't know exactly how we're going to do that yet. Peter.
Good morning, everybody. I'm going to keep my camera off because I'm having bandwidth issues, so apologies about that. We've been having pretty extensive discussion on the City of Portland staff about this, and assuming that the 0170 would apply to cities and counties in the metro area, which we think that's the case, but it's not entirely clear, so it would be good to clarify that. Generally, we appreciate that the LCD is raising the issue that the current state and regional performance standard isn't working particularly well. There are significant issues with it, particularly with regard to safety and equity and climate. I think the issue that we want to raise is that The way that the draft rule is written creates some conflicts. And I'll mention a couple of the big issues that we have and then offer a constructive solution, since I don't want to criticize without offering a solution. So first problem that we've identified is that you don't need 2 or more performance standards as called for in the draft rules. We're getting fairly close to recommending a VMT-based performance standard similar to that which has already been implemented in California in multiple cities and in Caltrans. It's a performance standard that advances all 8 of the objectives in the draft rule, and adopting a second performance standard creates the possibility or probability that there's conflict between the standards, and you recognize this in your opening slides. So there are the second problem that we want to raise is that it's fairly highly likely that at least one of the 2 performance standards for many agencies might be using the current VOC or LOS. And if you're adopting a multimodal performance standard and keeping the old standard, you're going to create a pretty significant conflict between the 2. It's like putting up road signs that point in 2 directions simultaneously. And that's not going to be particularly helpful. So we think that there are more effective and constructive ways to address the legitimate concerns about safety, for example, queuing. We've had this conversation with ODOT, and in fact, Joseph was part of the solution we came up with for our TSP, where we looked at and identified areas where there might be queuing onto a throughway. That wouldn't be a primary performance standard, though. So one of our suggestion for a constructive fix, and I'll send you language, is to clarify that there is a primary performance standard that jurisdictions would have to adopt that would meet the majority of those 8 objectives that you have. If an agency wanted to adopt a secondary performance standard, say queuing backing up onto a throughway, or even the old standard, they could do so, but it's clear that the primary standard, a multimodal standard that actually advances safety, equity, climate, is a primary standard. So that's something that we would put out there as a suggestion to reduce the likelihood of conflict and increase the likelihood that we're moving toward the objectives that have been identified. And I'm speaking fast because I'm trying to take up as little bandwidth as possible, airtime as possible, but I'd be happy to answer any questions. And also point out that we've actually done substantial work on adopting a VMT-based standard in Oregon. And my confidence level is very high that we are likely to do so, and we would be happy to share with other jurisdictions what we've done, and perhaps even the calculator that Fair and Peers is building for us now.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that, and I think we'll probably take up the City of Portland on your offer there for at least having some of those discussions for sure. Joseph, I think you were next.
Hi, this is Joseph from the City of Hillsborough. My comments were more tied to 325, but I just wanted to comment real quick on Peter's comment. As you probably know from my previous call, I'm not a fan of VMT as a measure, and I don't want to get into we can spend the whole time of this meeting plus several hours in a debate about VMT, and I don't want to go into that, but it's not, again, it's not as I mentioned before, it's supposed to be more of a comparative number. It's not supposed to be, it's not an accurate numerical number, and it's also not a very transparent number to the public. I mean, we're kind of responsible to be transparent and actually kind of demonstrate how a system is going to perform. So, but moving on to that, I have 4 questions regarding 325. And do you want me to just read you each question and have you answer it, Bill, or or read all of 4 questions all at once?
If we think that they're pretty short answers, we're trying to make sure that other people have a chance to speak as well. Maybe you can start with your first one, then we can move on to someone else and we can come back to you. That might make sense.
Does 325 apply to both legislative and quasi-judicial comprehensive plan amendments?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. I'd have to read and see what the text said. I don't have it right in front of me right now. I think our concept was, boy, that's something we're gonna have to take a look at. And one other point is that 325 applies to climate friendly areas, which will not be. I think this is an open discussion about how 325 applies in the Portland metropolitan area, because you're not adopting climate friendly areas like the other 7 metropolitan areas are. So I don't think right now that we're saying 325 applies in metro, just to be clear. But I think on that quasi judicial and legislative thing, I think 360 applies either way. I'm sorry, Rule 060 applies either way, right? So I can't remember. We had some discussions about this, but Matt, I don't know if you remember.
I think it would. I think the intention is it would apply to anytime you otherwise would have applied 060. Instead, you do 325 in the climate friendly areas. So I think yes, both. If the rule isn't clear on that, we can certainly work on improving that.
Yeah.
All right, should I go to next questions, or do you want to go to another person?
Why don't I move on to someone else, and then we can come back and make sure we get your other questions. Okay.
Okay.
Steve.
Yeah, I want to hear Joseph's questions. I just have a comment related to Peter's comments, and I really appreciate the attention to detail that Peter brings on these topics related to performance measures. So thank you. VMP is perhaps a solution that Metro and City of Portland might advance towards as one of an array of potential performance measures. And I think Peter's right that he suggested that it should be one or more performance measures, but they need to get at the goals that you're focused on here. And I think that's an important perspective to consider. The other one to consider is some performance measures struggle at more localized levels. They do very well for like a county or a region or a sub-region, but they don't do really well for a climate-friendly area or smaller, or smaller site development proposal where they're making modest changes. And so understanding that scale between different performance measures is really important. So it's very likely that some jurisdictions will end up with a regional sort of based performance measure for their transportation plan. It applies citywide. This is how they measure the connectivity citywide, for example, or percent of the system that has bicycle lanes, or percent of the system that has sidewalks. And those are important regional sorts of measures. But then when you go to do a plan amendment or a development review process, you're likely to need some other related kind of measure that wasn't directly used in the development of the TSP, because of the scaling issues between the different types of measures. Your TSP may have one measure that gets to a set of goals, and then your performance measures for your local site may be slightly different, but gets at the same sort of consistent approach. And I think that's allowing for that is going to be necessary in a variety of situations. Metro has been working on this and running into the same issue. We ran into this when we developed our transportation plan. And that's the other part of this, is Metro's working on regional performance measures for the region now. And if you guys adopt something and then they come up with something that's not quite consistent, it could create real challenges for the Portland metro area. Two other comments and then I'll be quiet. The first one,
just real quick, Steve, I did want to say, our rules don't prescribe any particular standards. So I think we're trying to be as flexible as possible in terms of both because I think we realize there's the scalability issues and then, compatibility with what Metro's doing. And of course, compatibility with the state facilities is a big one too. And these rules have been adopted in close coordination with Department of Transportation. So that's the other kind of piece here that we're trying to navigate. But go, yeah, if you've got just a couple other quick points,
and then
Steve.
let other people talk. The other one I do want to say is I think we have what, half a dozen, 6 or 7 city and county planners on this call, and you mentioned working with state planners. Your rules are for city and counties, and so we need to involve a broader array of jurisdictions from cities and counties that have experience working with these things and identify the issues. And I think having 6 or 7 cities or counties here is maybe 8 is not quite adequate. And my last comment is I see Ryan Marquette is on the call, and we just miss Ryan, and hope he's doing well. So, hi Ryan, take it easy. Now I'll be quiet. Thank you.
Hey Steve, good to see you again too.
Hey, I just wanted to maybe, Bill, if we had a moment to just clarify one thing, because I heard in the discussion here just the words performance measures and performance standards kind of getting mixed. And so I think we want to be careful because we use both in the rules, but to mean very different things. And so I don't know if you want to clarify that for a little bit, or just make sure that we're all using the same.
Yeah, just to be clear, we do have a set of performance measures in the rule that have to do with kind of system-wide, in some cases region-wide, transportation system performance across at the wider scale. And then I think the transportation standards are supposed to be a little bit more smaller scales. I think that the kind of way I'd put that, I don't know, Cody may be more eloquent in how he described it, but he just gave me the thumbs up. So I guess I was eloquent enough. Let's go to Rob.
Well, I said one important distinction is that the performance measures are for reporting on that annual cycle, and it's a reporting function. It's reporting. The performance standards really control the decision making that happens around a rezoning or a comp plan amendment. It's not the performance measures. Those don't come in when you're talking about that rezoning decision.
And to be clear, the reporting is annual, but the measures are only reported on a 4 to 5 year cycle. So you have to do the measures every year. Yeah. Rob, sorry.
Hi, yeah, I have a question about 3254, when a highway impact summary is required. And it said, if the climate friendly area contains a ramp terminal intersection, state highway, interstate highway, or adopted ODOT facility plan, how about an interchange area management plan? Does that trigger, because I think those can cover much bigger areas than a facility plan. Do you know whether that would trigger the need for a highway impact summary?
That's not the way the rule is written right now, and
Great.
that language came from ODOT. So
okay, great.
If it doesn't say IAMP, it doesn't mean IAMP. Yeah.
Okay, I just want to double check. Thank you.
Unless anyone else has anything else, Joseph, you had a couple more questions, I think.
Yeah, I want to just second what Steve said earlier. I agree with everything what Steve Kelly said. And then I just want to clarify my previous comment about BMT. When I was talking about transparency, I was talking about the more local approach on when we're doing a major TSP amendment, we can use BMT per capita, that's fine. But on a localized, if someone from the public's asking me, how is this intersection going to affect me? I'm not going to be able to answer that through BMT. I'm going to be able to answer that through queuing analysis or PC analysis or other type of safety analysis. So I want to clarify that. That's the way, like when I'm saying transparent, it's about telling that story. Moving on to my next question I have is regarding 325. If it's a new location that is, let's say we have a parcel that wants to move into the climate friendly area, are we completely excluded from doing a traffic analysis, even though they're not in the climate friendly area, but they are wanting to be, or how does that come into play?
So you're saying you want to amend the boundary of the climate friendly area to bring a new parcel into the climate friendly area?
Yes.
That's an interesting one. So that's the only change that's happening is they're being brought in, but are they also being upzoned or something like that at the same time?
I'm thinking like if they're quasi judicial and they're saying that they want to be brought in, are we still, can we still require a typical 060 analysis, or are they exempted just because they want it into the climate friendly area?
So the idea is I think we're clear that when you're setting the boundary for the climate friendly area and you're saying this is the climate friendly area now, and we're going to implement it and we're going to upzone, that those things go through the 325 process and not the 060 process. I don't know that we're very clear in the rules about, in the first place, Kevin, about how the boundaries are amended or how you, I don't know if annex is the right word, but you bring in areas into the climate friendly area over time. I would suspect that we would, use a 325 mechanism and not an 060 mechanism to do that. But Kevin, I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, that's a good question. I've been puzzling on the legislative versus quasi-judicial question you asked initially, Joseph. And, I think as we're thinking about how these rules would be implemented, by and large, we're expecting them to be legislative, right? This is a mandate to the city to basically adopt those entitlements for these climate-friendly areas, which typically is accomplished through a legislative process. Could a local government allow for quasi-judicial applications to expand climate-friendly areas? I think they could. I don't think that the department would oppose that process. And I guess my opinion is, as the rule is currently written in 0325, it would seem to say, no, it's not an 0060 review. It is this alternative review in 0325.
But I think maybe in general, we may need to add a little bit more clarity around how climate-friendly areas might adjust boundaries over time. We thought about how they start and how, but maybe how they evolve. We might need to think about that a little bit more.
Right, and there's language in the rule that speaks to, with the new HNA, local government, their population is growing. There is a process where CFA areas would be expanded over time to address that. That really isn't getting at a quasi-judicial decision. That might be a one-off site-specific request.
Let's go to Gabe. You've got your hand up.
Thanks. So I appreciate the hearing about the intent for, building in some flexibility as it relates to the performance standards. They're squishy, right? And so one of the things that we're looking at and running up to a set of amendments that would expand our measures related to TDM and our local traffic impact analysis is really about creating a new metric, right? That methodology. And, I tend to see enough of these types of analyses that that get litigated and challenged that, I'm concerned about a substantial evidence problem, right? And so as we move to that new metric, it seems like a really heavy lift for the city of Eugene, given this time frame. So I do appreciate hearing other ideas, work that's been done with other local jurisdictions, but I wonder at the state level, what's the current thinking around something akin to, say, the model code with HB 2001, or a set of guidelines or best practices, something in terms of the guidance that would help us to get to that new metric.
Yeah, thank you. I know the state's committed to doing guidance with these rules. I don't know that I can get a lot more specific about what resources we'll have available, or it sounds like the city of Portland's doing a lot of work, that Metro's doing a lot of work, that the state of California has done a lot of work, that we'll be able to borrow, hopefully, and disseminate the best practices, things like that. But I don't want to overpromise. I would like to underpromise and overdeliver if I can. But that the idea is that we will have resources to support local governments in developing these, and that we won't hopefully require them before we're ready for local governments to be able to implement those successfully. Brian Hurley, you had your hand up.
Thanks, Bill. This is Brian Hurley with the ODOT. ODOT Climate Office. Sorry about that. I have a clarifying question for Rob. When you were talking about the state facilities in the IAMPs, what section were you referencing? I'd like to double check that from my own knowledge. Do you
Sure,
have that handy?
325. Yeah, 325 section 4.
325 section 4.
And Brian, I just want to,
Facility plan. Yep. So I want to, oh, sorry, Julie, go ahead.
I was just going to chime in that my question was, if you look at section 6,
6A, correct. Yes, I am.
it talks about IAMPs, and so I wasn't sure what the
Correct.
difference was.
Thank you for having the same question as me.
Yeah, let me be clear about that real quick. I'm just gonna, I did get the rule up here on my screen. So let's see here. The highway impact summary as part of the multimodal transportation gap summary is when a climate friendly area is initially designated. 6 talks about trying to remember how we wrote this rule out.
It speaks to amendments to the adopted land use regulations.
Yeah. I think what 6 is supposed to be about is when, and maybe we need to be clearer about this, is when changes are happening, not when you're doing your initial adoption of the climate friendly area, but in the future. So I think, and I don't know why we have kind of we were supposed to have kind of a more minimal list of transportation facilities that then triggered that, because you're looking at the whole area. You need to look at like kind of a wide range of effects. But then when you're kind of getting into that parcel level in the future, that you really just want those that are maybe going to affect the ramp terminal intersection or something like that. And that was really what we were trying to get at there. Is this the exact right language for that? Maybe we need to make some tweaks.
Thanks, Billy. Yeah, maybe we can work on clarifying that, because we usually consider an IAM to be an adopted facility plan. So I think there's some cleaning up with that language that we can work on together. Thanks for clarifying. I appreciate it.
Yeah, and just to jump in on that, I think that, as I said earlier, I mean, IAMs can cover, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think they can cover a pretty big area. And if we're really just looking at the immediate impact to the ODOT facility, I mean, an IAMP will be a broader area that relates to ramps. And so the ramp, it seems like the ramp itself and that quarter mile is really what you're looking for here. Whereas if we're a quarter mile from an IAMP, that could be a huge, huge area. I had something else too, if I could just
sure,
adding to what Gabe was saying earlier. And you talked about the state looking at California, but I think, and as we've talked about before in other meetings, like knowing what can we do in Oregon with our unique state law and regulations here, it would be really helpful. That's why the model code would be so helpful, is because then our attorneys don't have to do all that legwork. You could do it for the whole state, and maybe even have some meetings where we can learn from each other. I know Portland's done a lot of work on this. And also, as we've talked about in other meetings too, that this would be really helpful for us, not just as it having to do with land use applications, or amendments, but just other TIAs and other ways that we can respond to development from a transportation perspective. Because I feel like in Eugene right now, we have a very small toolbox of things that we can require of developers, because I think there's so much hesitancy because some of the case law, and having the state come in and say, here's a toolbox that you can use to respond to development would be real helpful to us. The other thing we're doing that I think you may have mentioned is that we're looking also at transportation demand management regulations requirements on development. So it would be great to see if the state integrate that too into the thinking on this, so that, because that's also a way that developers can reduce trips, but in a sort of rather than just saying you have to have a trip cap, it's a more proactive way of working with the developers to put in place the right tools to help people. Because remember, the reason we're all doing this is to get people to drive less. So it's like putting in place the tools for the people that live in their developments to drive less. Thanks.
Thank you. I hear the request for tools, and I think we're going to need to work with ODOT on obtaining the resources and determining if that's definitely one of the pieces of the guidance and toolbox that we're going to develop as following up on these rules for sure.
You,
I will
you can put
mention
Evan on it because he's developed, or he can't do any more on parking because he's already developed the most comprehensive parking resource in the world, and we don't want him going any further. So maybe put him on the TDM TIA stuff. That would be great.
I'll talk to him about that. He's not on the call today, so I'm sure he'll be happy to hear that he's done everything he can do on parking, though. Real quick, though, I will plug a TGM has a TGM model code. It's mostly aimed at smaller cities, but we do have a module attached to that that has to do with transportation demand management and how to do TDM elements with development. It's based on some work that TGM did with City of Portland. It's been a while now, maybe a little bit long in the tooth, but there are some elements there that are useful for folks looking at the TDM piece of it. I'm going to go to Julie next.
Thanks. I keep putting my hand up and down because I keep getting triggered on thoughts. But one of the questions, and I remember early on thinking that part of this rule was going to limit the ability to use the VC as the only measure for TIAs. So is this the section that's addressing that, or is that somewhere else?
No, that's here.
So, but this is really, we've been talking about this as instead of 060, I'm talking more about just TIAs.
Well, let's see. In 170, and I'm sorry if I was unclear about this, it does say in section 1, this rule applies to performance standards that cities and counties use to review comprehensive plan and land use regulation amendments as provided in 060, and to review an application for development as provided in an acknowledged local comprehensive plans and land use regulations. So I assume that includes land use regulations include transportation impact analysis. Yeah.
Okay, so that's a lot broader application.
It is.
And I think, and therefore, a lot of potentially, relatively small, projects that are going to trigger this unknown standard.
Yeah. And I don't think, we don't, if you say in your local regulations wanted to change the thresholds for when these standards apply, something like that, that's absolutely a flexibility that local jurisdictions would have. We're not prescribing anything. We're not saying that you have to have TIAs. The state never said that. Or what your local land use regulations look like in terms of development review. The flexibility there.
Right. Okay, thanks.
Carl.
Thanks. I guess the points Gabe and Rob brought up made me think of something. I really appreciate those comments. But as a small jurisdiction, and the concern for, what can we actually require to develop our own set of regulations seems like a very large task. And I also think there should be some consistency across the state in how these things get applied, so that, someone developing in Phoenix, right next door to us, has a reasonable expectation if they cross the border over into Medford that there's at least some consistency on what the rules and regulations are. And then I guess Julie made the point about putting her hand up and down. She also brought up an idea for me on the 170. I had heard it was going to limit the use of VC and LOS. So that was my impression, at least. And I guess the way I read it now, I see that something else is required, but it seems to me like VC or LOS is still allowed as a primary determining factor, the way I read the rules. So I'm not sure if that's how you guys see it, but those are the two things I had. Thanks.
Yeah, no, thank you. So I'd say to your first point, I'm sorry I can't be more definitive in this call, but we are hearing loud and clear as a staff that local governments are wanting tools. Local governments are wanting guidance for, like, we don't do this anymore, what else are we going to do? And that, have maybe a couple or one or a set of things that people can really rely on, both legally and kind of operationally, just to make that work. We're hearing that. Love to develop that. I'm not saying we're not going to develop that. I'm just saying we need to work on the resources and everything that we're going to be doing as following the rulemaking. And I think this is on our list of things that we're going to need to work on. So I don't want to overpromise, is what I'm saying. And maybe I'm hedging myself too much, and maybe it's going to be fine. But we're hearing that. And so I do want to let you know. It's funny because people ask for flexibility to do things, and so we're leaving this wide open. And people like, what if you tell us exactly what we should do? So it's but I get it, I understand. So as far as your second point, which was about, I'm sorry, you just have to remind me real quick.
Sure. It seems to me like the use of LOS and VC is really.
Oh, right. Yeah. So, it's still permitted. I think the rule started out as don't do that anymore and do something else instead. And we've evolved a little bit to, if you choose to still use that as a measure, as a standard, you may do so. We're not requiring the use of that standard anymore. We heard from underserved population groups that congestion has impacts in neighborhoods that they may be getting a lot of pollution, things like that. So there are reasons why maybe we shouldn't throw that out altogether. So that's one reason why we've decided not to just say don't use that standard. Emma, you haven't heard from you yet.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. I'm just trying to wrap my mind around this and have been listening. It sounds like DLCD recognizes that this is a heavy lift, especially for smaller jurisdictions, and would need to provide resources to actually help it come to fruition. It sounded like a hopeful answer, but not a ton of clarity on exactly what that looks like and when. So I'm wondering, what happens if we don't get this adopted by January 1st, 2023, which even just doing a public hearing adoption process jointly with the county would be a long stretch to get done in that time frame, let alone the coordination of technical resources. And then my second question is, does this trigger a major TSP update, or can it be done as a standalone kind of quicker item to implement in advance of other parts of the rules?
Yeah, thank you. I know you came in a little bit late, Emma. One thing I did mention early on is that we are aware of that timeline not maybe making a lot of sense. So we're either going to push that timeline, get rid of that timeline, or just make it as basically as part of the next time you do a TSP update, which seems like it makes more sense to do it then. And then the question about what kind of TSP update does this trigger? It doesn't matter because you're doing your TSP update and you would do this at the same time. Does that make sense?
Yes, that does. I guess from thinking about the goals of this rulemaking, I'm wondering if there are any pieces that could be done sooner, and what might that look like? There's a ton of work to be done, so I don't want to ask for more, but I am trying to ground my thinking in the intention behind this whole rulemaking.
Yeah, absolutely. That's been a ongoing concern for us, is to balance the need for urgency, which the commission has told us very clearly that they wanted all this to happen very quickly, with what we've heard from local governments, which is this is a lot. We have a lot of other things going on. How are we actually going to make this happen in this time frame? And it's not always going to work in reality. And we can put all the timelines we want in the rule, and if it can't happen, then like what's the point? More finger wagging from DLCD is not going to make carbon emissions go down. So
from Springfield's perspective, I mean, I started here at the city, saw that our TSP has good policy action steps saying develop multimodal level of service, and so that's been our policy direction. We just haven't had capacity to deliver.
Yeah,
I'm wondering if focusing on integrating with the TSP update and then getting support to actually do the technical analysis needed for multimodal level of service and having that have a more consistent methodology statewide might be beneficial. I appreciated, I think, Carl's comment earlier about consistency. I'm thinking from a developer's perspective as well. If every jurisdiction they go to is different and everyone has their own methodology, that could be pretty confusing and kind of cause delay and cost and everything just because it's so piecemeal.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And I think, it's unlikely we're going to prescribe any particular standard in the rules. However, I think, developing common tools as part of guidance is absolutely something that I think we can. I'm trying to be non-committal, but I think at this point we're pretty committed to making sure this is going to work. And I think this is a big piece of it. I don't know, Matt, if maybe you can come in. You're my boss. You can tell me.
Well, I think it'd be a very high priority, as I can say that, for our budget. But the budget is a process, of course, going through legislative process. But this will be a high priority to be able to provide that help. I was also thinking about the timing, and of course, there'll be a timing, or there's some requirement in the rule that sets a timing or not. But local governments also have choices to do things before that. And so I was just wondering, I don't know if Emma or others, how often is 060 come up? Is it coming up every month, once or twice a year? Is it a major stumbling block for you often, where you've got some development that's a really good development, but 060 is causing the city to say no to something that the city wants to say yes to? Because that would be an opportunity to make these changes in your performance standards sooner rather than later. But I don't know how often that comes up for you, Emma, or for others.
This is when I'm wishing that my coworker who works in current development is reviewing the applications on the daily we're here, but he's in a development review meeting.
That's fine if you don't know.
I don't have the answer at the moment.
I'll jump in and say that we see at least half a dozen, if not up to 10, either plan amendments or zone changes that trigger the TPR analysis. And frankly, with the level of service standard so low, it's not very useful. So, and I'll just
to clarify.
Yeah, go ahead.
And by so low, do you mean we accept a lot of congestion in Eugene? Is that what do you mean by so low?
Correct.
Okay.
And so the result is really ineffective mitigation, right? And so that's why I think from a policy perspective, this is promising, right? It takes us, I think, where we want to go, but that toolbox is the thing that is most important, at least in my mind, as it relates to current planning.
Thank you. Joseph, let's go back to you.
One of my other questions was actually related to what we were talking about earlier regarding section 325, subsection 6. Basically, my question is with the creation of 325, do we really need to have 060 subsections 8 and 10 that deal with multimodal mixed use areas? Because it seems like this whole 325 it should be replacing it. So it seems like you can delete 8 and 10 from 060 then. And I'm just curious if you guys looked into that.
Good question. We've definitely heard that before and have chatted that over. So one thing to keep in mind is that 325 is going to apply just in metropolitan areas, and 325 doesn't even apply, but the way it's written right now, in the Portland metropolitan area. So Rule 60 applies everywhere across the state, outside of metropolitan areas, inside the Portland metropolitan area. And there are mixed-use multimodal areas in the Portland metro area right now that the MMAs would still continue to apply. I don't believe we have any that have been adopted outside of a metropolitan area yet, but if coastal communities in particular run into V over C issues along Highway 101 a lot because of the seasonality. They don't have the same kind of like peaking that the metropolitan areas do, but many the OTCs, a lot of the alternate standards they've adopted over the years have been in coastal communities. I could see, say Newport or something doing an MMA or something like that in the future. So, I hate to remove that because it really does apply statewide, and it's not necessarily a perfect analog to climate-friendly areas. So that's the reason why that's staying in there for now. Bob.
Thanks. I just wanted to comment on a couple of things. First, I wanted to second the comments that you got earlier from Peter Hurley at the City of Portland about moving to a BMT as a primary performance measure. I hope that you all know that over the last 5 years that California has shifted away from LOS and VC as a measure to VMT. And because it really properly and effectively achieves the kind of objectives that we're after. They've also done a lot to develop really extensive documentation, including local ordinances and tools to guide the kind of mitigation measures that we need to get. Comparatively, I think we're in the dark ages. We're well behind California, and I hope we look to that. The second thing that I wanted to do, and I'll pass a couple of comments on to DLCD in the chat, is to talk about the performance measures in section 910. And I don't know if anybody else has talked about those yet. But I want to say that we should have measures that are really good and relevant to actions that are effective in reducing emissions. And there are two that jump out at me that could use some more work. First is the transportation options measures. And I think what we ought to be doing is counting not just participation in these programs or activities, but whether or not we're providing the kinds of options or getting the kind of participation in programs that are really effective. And I would say that ought to be at a level that is equivalent to the value of free parking, which is roughly $5 a day. So let's measure things that are effective in terms of transportation options. Similarly with transit, and there was quite a discussion about this earlier, I think, in another meeting, was we ought to be measuring whether or not people are, first of all, within walking distance, not crow flies, because we really want to trigger local actions that will reduce walking distance or make sure that people have access to transit. And the same is true for the distance involved. I'd say we ought to be focusing on a quarter mile, which is really the sweet spot of walking distance for access to transit in our smaller communities. So those are the comments that I hope that you'll consider as this goes forward. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Bob. I mean, just to be clear, this meeting is mostly about the performance standards and not so much the measures, but we'll take your comments. And I know that you can follow up with Cody Myers, who's our lead staff on the measures on that. I'm sure you probably have followed up with him before on those. So, but we'll be happy to talk more about those. I'm just looking at hands up. I think, Carl, you're next.
Thanks. I just wanted to offer one final thought on the asking for more definition around these performance standards. To me, this is really, it's the meat and potatoes of how we measure the impacts of zone changes and other comp plan changes. And while in other areas, I think, getting too detailed did get pushback. I think on this one, at least my perspective is, because there's so many unknowns and it's such a key issue, this is where I would like to see more detail. So just wanted to offer that.
Thank you for that. Steve.
I just really quickly wanted to respond. I think VMT is a fantastic measure in a lot of circumstances. It's not necessarily the panacea that it may be perfect in every circumstance. There are cases where a really desirable land use change could generate more VMT because it does all sorts of other things that our community wants. And so I think there needs to be some flexibility there. I appreciate the desire to use VMT, and I think it's great in a lot of circumstances. California, I've looked at what they've been doing down there. I've gone to meetings, conferences about how they've been utilizing VMT. And it is really a comparative number. So you could have a very intensive land use that does a lot of great things, mixed multimodal land use, but does generate more VMT because of that comparison that you'd be conducting. The other thing that, I lost my train of thought. Let me get back to me, go to somebody else, and I'll maybe raise my hand again. Thank you.
Emma, I don't know if you still have your hand up or if you had something else.
Nope, sorry.
Joseph, did we get all of your questions?
pretty much there. The other one, which is another quasi-judicial legislative question regarding subsection 2 of 325, whether that is meant for just major TSP amendments or doing a gap summary analysis, or are you also tying it to small legislative and quasi-judicial comprehensive plan amendments as well?
I'm sorry, which section of 325 are you asking about?
Section 2, whether that, like there was like, well, pretty much the rest of the sections that was kind of going into all this additional type of analysis that's needed. And I was just trying to get a sense, was that more tied to doing a major TSP amendment, or is it tied to small comp plan amendments, just as, like I mentioned before, legislative, or if we're just, doing one small property, do we have to do the entire, what's listed there in 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6?
So I think, yeah, section 2 is basically saying when you're adopting the climate friendly area for the first time is what and it's giving you two options there. It's saying you can either do a TSP update, which takes the climate friendly area into account, or you can just do this transportation modal transportation gap summary. We expect most people are going to do B because of the timing. You're not going to do a whole TSP update to do that, but it might work out for some folks, and it might be a little bit cleaner that way. So that's why we wanted to preserve that option.
Okay, I think it's just more, I need to go back and look at the rule again, but I think it wasn't clear. It seemed like it makes sense if it's just when you're doing it in the major TSP, bringing in the CFA, it wasn't clear that those other smaller amendments are exempted from that process. And that's, it needs, I guess, I recommend if it's not in there, then put some clarification in there that it's for that circumstance.
Having reread the rule, having not read it in a little while, it's not super clear about some of these things, and I just want to I think I'm hearing that, and we'll make sure that's in the notes to be clear about what applies when, which process you need to go through initially versus in the future. And I think we had some ideas about how that could be clear, but I think just in the process of editing it and putting it all together, maybe it just got a little bit mushier than we would have liked, which is why we have these meetings. Peter.
Just want to say that I think Steve and I are probably in substantial agreement. I've been really have been inspired by some of the work that he did a number of years ago in the with regard to performance measures broadly, and have continually gone back to that to look at and draw inspiration from. And I'll agree with him that VMT, while a fantastic measure in many areas, is not a panacea, and that's why I suggested that we adopt or at least allow adoption of a primary measure that could then be supplemented by other measures at different scales. So I'll follow up with you, Steve, because I think that there's some substantial commonality here, and just wanted to put that on the record.
Thank you for that, Peter. So we're at noon now. I don't know that we're going to necessarily need to hold a second work group meeting on this topic, because I think, frankly, a lot of the issues are, we've heard the questions on timing and on resource and on, kind of follow up and resources, and a lot of that's not even in the rule. That's going to be following the rulemaking, and I think we're going to need to do a lot of work there. But I'm going to go ahead and just follow up with Julie and Steve. You've got your hands up still, so I want to make sure we get you guys. But thank you, everybody. Before noon hits, I just want to thank everybody for joining us today, and really appreciate the feedback. I know this is kind of a big change, and appreciate all the help from everybody in the comments. Julie.
Just two quick things. One, just can the effective date be tied to the availability of resources? So, have it subject to availability of resources. And
yeah, no, that was rolling around in my brain too. Like, how can we make this work so that we're not requiring something that we haven't given people tools to do? We might be able to do something like, say the commission shall authorize this at a certain time. I don't know. We can probably figure out some way of making that work. I don't know if that is something that legal will go for. We'll have to see what we can do there. It might be, commission might have to, we have to put the stuff in there and say the commission can do it when they want, or I don't know. We'll have to figure that out, if that makes sense, or if that's even the right policy choice. Cody, you had your hand.
Okay. One other quick thing is the I got kicked off earlier, so
Okay.
quick thing is the section 2 that you were just talking about in 325 and those other sections about the multimodal gap analysis stuff. I found it confusing when I read 320, subsection 4 that talks about, the requirements for climate friendly areas, and it refers to a bunch of stuff that have to be in the TSP. And then this seems to be saying that you don't actually have to do that if you do the gap analysis. And so it would be helpful to be clear that if you do that gap analysis, you're not subject to those things in that other section. If that's true.
I would say, well, I would say we should have been clearer in 320 about what we're expecting and when we're expecting it. We expect TSPs at the time they're adopted will, if you're doing your climate friendly area adoption first and then updating your TSP later, that your TSP is going to do the right type of planning in the climate friendly area that's required in those rules that are referred to in 320. And when you're doing your initial adoption, I guess it's really just the multimodal gap analysis. We probably should just remove those particular references or couch it in some different language, Kevin, in 320, so that we're a bit clear about that process piece of it. I don't know, Kevin, what you think?
Yeah. In short, yes.
All right, Steve.
Regained my train of thought, so just want to finish my thoughts. Real briefly, section 11, it looked like the entire area 100 through 999, I guess, applies to the metro area. So perhaps there's additional changes or clarifications elsewhere, but that needs to be clear what applies where. Sections 900 and 915, I've been trying to figure those out. They're pretty confusing. The references aren't to the sections that are still, they're moving around still. So it's challenging to figure out what applies where, because it's still in process. And I get that. But we will just need to be clear as we proceed through this, what applies where and when. So thank you for that. And then my final comment, my train of thought comment, was on the flexibility. And I think it's really important that jurisdictions have the flexibility, not just in performance measures and standards, but throughout, to respond to the public engagement that is required. So when we go out and talk with the community, right now there's a little bit of this checkbox because we've got all of these requirements that are laid out. And if there's comments, we're going to say, well, we've got these other requirements. We can't do that. We've got it. And so we need to have enough flexibility throughout the rules. But it's applicable very much so to the performance standards, because that's the key section of how we measure what's going on, that we have the ability to say, oh, okay, we've listened to your input and we're changing the plan to respond to it because these are your lived experiences. These are your concerns. This is your situation in your part of the community. So we need that flexibility. And I'll just leave it at that. I thank you for the time and appreciate your attention and to listening to the few planners that are on these calls. So thank you again.
No, thank you. Appreciate it. Any other questions? I guess I said I would just take the last two. So thank you, everybody. Have a good lunch.